Hey folks, thank you for coming to my Facebook Live event where I'll be taking your questions about how to deal with some play therapy challenges. So I'm going to give it a minute or two for people to start to come on board. Awesome. So I see a couple of people are showing up. This is great news. And what I'm here to do is really take a look at what are some of the things that you're dealing with in play therapy, the challenges that you have. Before I start to answer some of those questions, and a couple of folks were kind enough to send them to me beforehand, so I'll start with those, is this is really important. One is please do not identify any kind of client or student that you're working with in any way, shape, or form as you're asking any kind of questions. And number two, this is not play therapy supervision. So I'm really looking for you guys to ask some sort of broad-based questions rather than real situation-specific ones. I will encourage you, if that's where you're at, is that this is not the right format for you. You really do need to go get some supervision and play therapy. So that being said, one of the other kind of rules I wanted to lay out is that people have really different ideas about training and calling themselves play therapists and doing play therapy. So for those of you who don't know that much about me, let me just tell you a little bit. 25 years as a play therapist. I'm also a licensed mental health professional, and my real kind of foundation in play therapy is humanistic. So a lot of what I'm going to refer to, my preferences in terms of the work that I do, really fall in that humanistic play therapy category. So you might be hearing some different things. Another bias, and it's a pretty strong one that I have, is that you should not be doing play therapy if you are not formally trained in play therapy. So reading a book on play therapy or hearing about it in a portion of a graduate course, that's, to me, just doesn't cut it. And I think one of the things that you'll find is that when you really get formal training in play therapy and you're able to practice and get supervision on that, that's going to help you deal with a lot of these things that come up anyway. So that's my speech. But let me get right to these questions because that's what you're really here for, right? And the other thing that I would say, I know I'm saying I'm going to get to the questions and then I go off on a tangent, but the other thing that I would say is if you have other ideas about other Facebook Live events that might be helpful to you in your work with children and doing play therapy, please let me know about those. So throw those in the comment box or private message me when this is over, all those kind of things. That's what I'd like to hear about. Okay, so one of the first questions that I got had to do with what do you do when you're working with a child who is on the autism spectrum and you're using play therapy. So first, I'd like to say that there's a couple of different approaches to play therapy that take up working with kids on the autism spectrum. And so first, one of the things that you're going to have to figure out, if you don't already know, is kind of like, what is your theoretical orientation? What's your approach to using play therapy? And then the other thing that you really have to assess is where this child falls on the autism spectrum. So there's a bunch of different considerations to take in. One is how well trained and prepared are you to even work with kids on the autism spectrum? Two, how well trained are you to work with kids using play therapy? And then what are the different kind of modes of play therapy that you can use with kids on the spectrum? So one of the things that I will say is that I found a lot of success, and this runs counter to some of what you'll see out there in using child-centered play therapy with kids on the autism spectrum. It shouldn't work. And the reason why it shouldn't work is because the relationship is the key, is the change agent, right, in child-centered play therapy. And that's what kids with on the autism spectrum really struggle with, right? But I think what you will find happens is that if you can set your goals in terms of how fast you want therapy to progress, what your expectations are for that child to gain out of your work, is that child-centered play therapy really does some very cool things when you're using it with kids with autism spectrum disorder. So here's what the catch is, though. You have to remember that it's going to be slow. So that warm-up phase, that's usually 3 to 5 sessions with most children, is going to be different with neuroatypical children. So with kids on the spectrum, that can take way longer. How you measure that warming up stage, that connection that you have with that kid, also has to be looked through a different lens. And so for kids with autism spectrum disorders, I'm looking for, did they make eye contact with me? Did they turn their body slightly toward me? Are they showing any form of relationship and connection with me? My experience has been, and the first kid I ever saw with autism spectrum disorder was 19 years ago, and he was really my teacher, and he just taught me, go slow, set realistic goals and expectations, and make sure you're doing that with the parent as well. And so you really want to make sure that that's the spirit of what you're doing when you're working with kids on the spectrum. I come from that humanistic approach, right? So I'm not interested in teaching them anything. I'm interested in them learning. And so they're going to learn from what's happening in the relationship, from hearing themselves, from being part of a participant observer, really, in their own play. And so that's going to happen naturally. But if your orientation is, I need to be teaching this child something, I need to be doing something, then you're going to want to try a different play therapy approach. Child-centered humanistic approaches wouldn't exactly work for you, but I will tell you, if you do them by the book, they will work with kids on the spectrum. So Kelly, I hope that answered your question. You were the one who had that. And I'll move now to the second question. And then as I'm going, and you can see I talk really fast, is if you have follow-ups or additional questions that you want to answer, just post them and I will do my best to answer as many of them as possible. So the next question actually had to do specifically with child-centered play therapy and sticking with the process and the procedures, so to speak, when kids are upset. Triggered was another word that was used in this question, and I'm going to add another word here because I think this is what Elijah, that you were talking about, also dysregulated. So what happens when you're in session and you're following that child-centered play therapy protocol where you are tracking and you're reflecting feeling and you're returning responsibility and you're setting limits and the child really leads the way? What happens when that child is really upset or thrown off by something in the room or just comes in really dysregulated? So this may sound like a cop-out answer, but it is. That means you have to stick to that process with full integrity. One of the things that we know neurologically happens is that dysregulation is contagious, just like regulation. So it behooves you to really be centered and grounded in your approach and to keep yourself regulated, which I just want to honor can be really super difficult when the child is triggered, when the child is dysregulated. So I'm really going to encourage you to stick even more forcefully, really stay by the book when the child is triggered or dysregulated or upset. The other thing is, and I think this is super important, is that your decision making in that play therapy room always has to be clinical first. So you have to make your decisions based on what's clinically most appropriate for this child. This is my favorite play therapy approach, right? So to be able to, and I do think that's more of an intermediate or advanced place to be in terms of play therapy and clinical approaches in general, is that, but I do think that that is super important. And let me give you an example. So I worked with a little girl years ago who presented meeting the diagnostic threshold for anorexia. So even though she was only like 9 years old, she showed up in that presenting problem, anorexia. Then, and she had lost, like, in a year, she should have gained 10 pounds. She lost 10. She was completely restricting her intake and everything. So my decision was, I'm going to still use child-centered play therapy with her, because in child-centered play therapy, I'm returning power and control, one of the elements of eating disorders, right, to this child. So I really wanted to make sure that I did that. However, working with lots of people over the years who are either have an eating disorder or at least disordered eating, I knew one of the things that was missing was that my client, even though only a little kid, 9 years old, was not seeing food as a universal connector anymore, that she became frightened of eating. So one of the things that I did, which was not child-centered at all, was that I put pretzels in a bowl in the room during our play therapy sessions. And the reason I did that was not based on my play therapy approach, but was based on my clinical approach. My clinical approach was to see her have a relationship with food again and to see food as social. And it was really, I mean, it worked out. So it was really cool when that happens. But, gradually after a few sessions, she would take a pretzel, do her child-centered play therapy, and I would follow the whole protocol for that. And then a couple sessions, after that, she ate the whole bowl of pretzels. 2 or 3 sessions after that, she asked if she could get a refill and maybe make a smoothie. So it really worked out super well. But that's just an example about what I'm saying in terms of you have to make a clinical decision, then a play therapy approach decision. And that should be that way always, is that you're filtering through that lens. I don't know, Elijah, if I answered your question fully. I sure hope that I did. But what I'm getting at there and using that example is that I can imagine some situations where the child is so upset, so triggered, or so dysregulated that you have to make a different clinical decision than doing exactly what you're doing in that moment, even if you're following a particular child-centered approach to the T. That to keep them safe, you would still have to make a different decision. And actually, I'm thinking of one of those, and this isn't super a super exaggerated case of that, but I worked with a little girl who, when she would come into the playroom, there was an Elmo stuffed animal, and she was terrified of that Elmo stuffed animal. I have no idea why. She couldn't speak to it, but I knew when she came in and she would glance over at that Elmo stuffed animal, that she would go like, I don't like it, that kind of thing. And so, so not following any particular play therapy protocol in that mode, just thinking why would I want to have a kid in a room, or any client in a therapeutic space where they were finding something terrifying? So rather than move to sort of reflect her feelings, or saying you can cover Elmo up, or that Elmo really scares you, is I just took it and threw it outside the door. And I just made sure that every session that I threw it outside the room before she came in. It was just too much for her. And so in order for me to provide all the other things that I hope to provide in my play therapy work with her, Elmo needed to be out of the room. So I guess that's the kind of thing that I'm saying is, sort of figuring out, is there something that I can do? Is there something that I can do to help this child in this way? Or does the clinical protocol, the clinical play therapy protocol in and of itself allow for that? And actually, now that I think about it, there's one other thing I want to say with regard to that, is that sometimes I do think that that's really about that even though it appears that the child is triggered and upset and dysregulated, it's about what's going on for us. So doing whatever you need to do to make sure you walk into those sessions as grounded and centered as you can be, and then getting supervision around kids that are upsetting you in that way. So I hope that answered your question, Elijah. So other questions? We still have some time left. Any other questions that I can address? Let me see. I need to actually put my glasses on to figure that out. Okay, cool. So I see that that makes sense to Elijah, so I'm happy to hear about that. Okay, what other kinds of questions do you guys have about play therapy in general? This is your part, because I'll just keep talking if you don't give me specific questions. And so I'm going to until I get my next question. So here's what I find is the most common questions asked have to do with dealing with parents. So, and I will tell you also a caveat to this is that although I've written a book about how to deal with parents, and I do have webinars and seminars of dealing with parents, those for whatever reason are not as well intended as you would think by the number of questions that I get with regard to that. So I do a lot of video conference supervision with people really all over the world, and sometimes I just sit and reflect after, well, I always actually sit and reflect after those supervisions. And one of the things that I notice is that many times we're not even talking about children. We're talking about their parents. So even though the supervision is supposed to be focused on what's going on for the kids, that's not what we wind up focusing on. We wind up focusing on what's going on with their parents, or how to talk to parents. So a couple of things that I'd like to just sort of say about that to help you structure that, if that's one of the challenges that you're dealing with, is first of all, most of the parents that we are dealing with are really doing their best. And so sometimes I make that like a mantra, especially if I'm upset about decision that the parent made with regard to their child or whatever, is I will literally, before I meet with the parent, be like, they're doing their best. They're doing their best. They're doing their best. So that's one thing. The other, I would say, and I'm going to list 3 things that I think are imperative in dealing with parents. The other is to really trust that parents are the expert on their children. And so as much alphabet soup you can have and trainings and degrees and all that kind of thing that you have under your belt, that parent knows their child in a way that we can never. And so I really try to extend that kind of respect to parents in that way. And then the third thing, and I think this is also vitally important in just situating yourself in communicating with parents, is that culturally we blame parents for anything that's not quite right with their kids. And so when we're doing consultation with parents in play therapy, we really want to make sure that we're not part of that, but that we also realize that parents are coming, even bringing your child for therapy in some ways says like, I've done something wrong with my kid. I need a professional. I need another adult to help me with this. So I always really come at it thinking about those 3 things, is that this is a really difficult thing for a parent to do, to bring their child to therapy and to ask for help. And partly is because of just the way society looks at that. And so most of us haven't had any training in parenting. And so you wing it a little bit. And I think that's part of what parents feel really insecure about. And they do make mistakes, but you can be really helpful to them in that way. So I just kind of intuited that might have been a challenge that you guys deal with out there, because that's, to be honest, the one that shows up most often in supervision is the questions about how to deal with parents. And unless there's another question, I got one. So Joe just asked, how about the challenges in working with children who are a little older using child-centered play therapy, like your 8 to 10-year-olds and older than that? There's such great, thank you, Joe. There's such great diversity in 8 to 10-year-olds. I'm even thinking about like, I have a 10-year-old girl that I work with who looks and acts more like 13 or 14. And I have a 10-year-old boy that I work with who looks and acts more like 6. And they're both like within like appropriate developmental kind of ways of navigating the world. So here's the thing is first you have to assess where's that kid at, right? And so where are they developmentally? I had one of my favorite play therapy kids ever. Well, she was only a play therapy kid for about a minute because she walked into 7-year-old girl, walks into the therapeutic playroom, kind of checks the whole place out, and then says to me, I think I'm a little too mature for this room. And you know what? She was right. She was too mature for that room. And she had the insight and knowledge of self enough to know that. So I just honored that, and we used a different room because of that. But one of the things that I would say is that for the most part, I'd say 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds belong in the play therapy room. I think it gets a little dicey when you have some 9, 10-year-old girls in particular who have started menstruating or are close to that. I feel like then the playroom starts to feel kind of distant and different from that for them. I would say, however, that I still always want to give that age group, particularly, I'm going to go to the higher end of that age group, Joe. I really want to give that 10 to 12-year-old age group the option of the playroom. And I think part of that is because what they're grappling with developmentally. So that same 10-year-old girl who's menstruating and is having feelings about like interest in like sexual activity and things like that, and can kind of feel her body respond to that, she still loves playing and is grappling with that part too. So sometimes the way I put it to the children that I'm working with is I use more like of the IFS kind of language or intra-family systems language. And I'll say like, I wonder if there's a part of you that wants to stay in the playroom today. And then I think one of the things that we sometimes get caught up with as play therapists is if they're not playing, but they're just sitting in the playroom and talking with us, more like a traditional verbal-based counseling, that's still okay because they feel comfortable in that room. I wouldn't, even if they never touched a toy but we're still engaged and there was still that therapeutic relationship, I still would keep them in the playroom. I think it's when they feel like the room is babyish. I've heard, I've definitely had some kids, say things like that. So I would use your judgment of your individual client. If they're really turned off by the room, if it's really babyish or to them, or they think they're too mature for it, or, there's just some kids who, when they walk in that room, it's not the right place for them because of just kind of the way they carry themselves. I don't know if that explains enough of it, but I do always want to at least offer it. And on the flip side of that, I will also say that because I also work with adults and teenagers, is that when they're struggling with things, when they're from their past and they're really kind of stuck there, I also always offer them an opportunity to, do you want to go in the playroom? That kind of thing. Do you want to see if we can work this out in there? And I'm very encouraged by the number of adolescents and adults over the years who've done that and really been able to, like, it'll only be like 1 or 2 times that they'll come in, but it sort of like situates them back into their child selves, and then they can get unstuck. I don't know how else to explain it. So sometimes I think that, again, that becomes the clinical decision, is that where are they developmentally, period, but then where are they at a particular moment? What are they working on in any other additional clinical work that we're doing with them? Let me see, Joe, if I answered your question as completely as I wanted to. Yeah, so I think I I do think that girls start to age out around 10, and I do think that boys start to age out around 12. And one of the things that I do notice about working with boys that are 10, 11, 12-year-old is that their play becomes increasingly more like sporty and physical in that way. So just being prepared for that, I kind of call it like the play therapy workout program, because it is it's very large motor skill kind of thing where that, that's how they sort of navigate the playroom. So, okay, I think so Joe, I hope I did you justice. Oh yes, you said thank you. That was very nice. Okay, so Kristen wants to know, what's my best tip, suggestion for self-care to get you through the day after a trauma-filled play therapy session in the afternoon? Okay, so I actually have several. And I think the best tip for me might not be the best tip for you. So I'm going to talk about it in a couple of different ways. Firstly, I'll say that to be prepared to work with kids who are traumatized. If you think like, oh, that's not my specialty, I'm not going to be dealing with kids that are traumatized, surprise, there's no way you can work with children and not work with traumatized children. It's just who shows up. And I also think a lot of times you don't know that they're traumatized, but it turns out that in your work with them, you realize that they are. So they might be referred for aggression or like depressive, kind of anxious symptoms, irritability, not sleeping, wetting the bed. It could be anything really. And then it turns out that they were traumatized. And perhaps the adults in their lives didn't define what they had been through as trauma, or that it was unknown to the adults in their lives. Okay, that being said, one of the things that I do to help me when I'm dealing with kids who have been traumatized, and you can just, I don't know if the rest of you feel this way, but it like sits on me from it. I really feel it viscerally. So I wipe it off. Literally after a session, I will just take a few minutes and, kind of brush that off of me. I think I actually have it right here on my desk, so I'm going to show it to you. Is I keep this at my desk at work. I keep it in my therapeutic office. I have to keep asking myself, is this mine? Does this belong to me? Do these feelings, does my, that yuck feeling, and I know I'm talking about a play therapist, so I can use the word yuck. Does that yuck feeling stick with me? If it does, I have to ask myself, is it mine? So one of the things that I do is I do the brushing, I do the, is it mine? A lot of times will just have a cup of tea. That seems to work for me. Some things I like to do with my supervisees is have them create a sand tray of what that session was like, kind of put it in the sand, leave it there to do its thing. Sometimes it's not even a full sand tray, but just choosing some figures. What was that like in that session with that child? Is there a figure that represents that? The other thing that you can do is you can really do a lot of self-supervision around this, where you could write a letter to the figure that you pick, or one of the figures that winds up in your sand tray. You could also write a letter to the child, or the person who's harmed or traumatized the child, to just do, and when I say write a letter, I mean an uncensored letter that you're never that you're never ever going to send. And another way of doing it is to write a letter to trauma itself. Is just maintaining. It's interesting because I think you kind of have to maintain a relationship with trauma, and yet at the same time be able to say like, okay, this is, we're done for today, and make sure that you're compartmentalizing that, but paying attention to it. If you just kind of ignore it and don't do any self-care around it, then it is going to stick with you, and it's going to pop up in really insidious ways that you couldn't have accounted for. So I think I think part of it also is knowing, I will say one other thing about this, is that part of it is knowing not just having one self-care activity, because that one self-care activity will not always work. So for instance, like I'll go for a run and I like to think about, like, as I'm running, all that stuff is kind of coming off me. It doesn't, not sticking with me. And that works great, except when it doesn't. And that's when you need some of those other activities. So really having like a plethora of self-care activities, because the same one doesn't always work with the same kid, with the same situation, with the same therapist. And so I know that just looking by some of the names here is, you know, that some of you are also doing supervision or will be doing supervision. So just being attentive to those kind of things. I actually, now that I think about it, have a lot more to say about supervision and taking care of yourself. But anyway, our time is just about up. I'm glad to hear that you guys are finding this helpful and that you like some of the suggestions that I made. I'd love to be able to do another one of these and stay connected and supporting this community that we have. So I'm going to say goodbye for now, but I'm going to really encourage you to give me other ideas. I'd be happy to do this again, to have some of you join me in it. I think that if we keep supporting each other, then we keep supporting the kids that we work with too. So thank you very, very much for joining and participating. And let me know what you thought. Either tell me in person or send me an email or a direct message. Thank you. Have a good rest of your night. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.